you here today for this presentation and panel discussion on dyscalculia. It's really, this is organized by Roberta. I'm going to hand over to her in just a second, but it's just a real pleasure and an honor for the Fields Institute to be able to host the events of Art Sci and feel like this is part of course, what we do is make opportunities for research and mathematics to happen. But part of that also is making sure that we understand that we're trying to reach out and think about the interactions between mathematics and other parts of life, including art and education and the way that people think about mathematics. So I'm very excited to hear today's presentations. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's very appreciated. So as I said, as Deirdre said, so this is actually part of an outreach program that started last year. And the Fields Institute was I'm very grateful that the Fields Institute stepped in and helped us out. And I also need to thank other supporters such as the University of Toronto Jackman Humanities Institute, which also helped us install the exhibition, and the location, which is my own college, new college, for which I'm very, very grateful, because it's a college actually that is mostly undergraduate, but mostly STEM students. And they really, like, this exhibition really resonated with them, because right now they're taking all of those one-on-one first year math courses, and the struggle is real. So without further ado, I would like to introduce this panel. So as I said, this is a part of a panel. This is part of a program that is in 3 parts. It was supposed to be 1, and then it became 2, and now it's becoming 3. So the parts are, so we had the exhibition by Piché, who will deliver the first presentation. Then the panel today, which featured experts in the field and in math education, and they will explain what their findings, such as Darja Barr, Professor Ansari, Professor John Mighton, and we will have a discussion. I would like to have an animated discussion after the presentations. So I will call them up. They will do the presentation. They will go down, and then we have the seats for all of them, and we will open the floor for questions and various discussions. Then this is not over. So at the end of the exhibition, so the exhibition will come down on October 15th. And on October 16th, we have another panel to conclude the exhibition. And for those people who haven't seen the exhibition, you see one of the pictures here, but please do go and check out the exhibition, and please do fill out a survey which has been compiled by our colleagues at History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, and some who are engaging in an exchange with the University of Edinburgh. And so we will have a final roundtable that features them and some of our guests who are here today. So Anne. So I'm calling Anne. So she will explain to you what is this all about. And she has been working in technology since the early 90s. Are you gonna say the context? Are you gonna talk? Okay, she's gonna talk about the context of where she's from. But yeah, she's esteemed. Oh dear, what happens? Okay, she's a photographer. She used to be a technologist, and I'm very, very grateful that she has, of all the places, she had decided to exhibit her series here. This exhibition is not, so you see the outcome of the exhibition, but you don't see the work that has been done around it. There was a massive research project that involved several faculties, including people from fields such as Pam Britton, who is now moderating online, Amanda Cho, who is also online, and she's from the faculty of, from the Department of Mathematics. We had several instructors and several professors from both University of Toronto and York University, and also some people from OASI. So without further ado, Anne, you can stand here.
We have music. We have music. we have music. I have a notebook because my memory is 3 feet or 3 seconds. So and that's the extent of my math as well. So yeah, thank you all for coming here. Thank you for hosting us. And Roberta, thank you for what you do for SciArt Salon. I think it is absolutely fantastic. So I'll just talk to you a little bit about who I am and a little bit about why I'm doing this and a little bit of context about the picture that you see. And then I'll happily hand the mic over to Daniel, or you guys can argue about that one. So as Roberta said, my name is Anne Piché and I'm a photo-based artist out of Ottawa. Everybody has their 5 seconds of fame, and my 5 seconds is that I am the first female electronic technician hired by the RCMP a while ago. And in that particular position, I got to hear a lot of, I don't do science, I don't do technology, I don't, I'm an art person, I would prefer to do arts over tech work. And of course, I don't do math, which is the name of the exhibition. And it's kind of funny because I used to sit there and think, well, I don't do math either, but here I am to fix your radio. So let's see how that works out. So that was my first career. And then my second career, I turned into a photo-based artist. I took my formal training at the School of Photographic Arts in Ottawa. And it was there that I decided that I wanted to draw on my experience with all these people telling me that I don't do math and wearing it like a badge of honor. I wanted to create visual dialogues between arts and science. What I really wanted to do is tell people that they're not separate boxes. They can be one box and one can help the other. So that's where I started. So I don't do math is a continuation of that dialogue. And if you go over to the DG Ivy Library, and I hope you do, and I hope you sign the guest book and let me know what you think. Because I read those, it really is helpful when people talk about their own experiences, and I use on that to develop the series further. So it's a photographic exploration of dyscalculia at the ground level, but at the 100,000 foot level, it's a question about our attitude towards math and what society thinks about math. It's a series of math formulas. So this is one of them. It's a series of math formulas that have been reinterpreted as a photograph. Usually I start with the image and then I find the formula afterwards. So I don't usually dwell on how I take an image because the conversation never gets to why I took it. It's all about how, and that's not the conversation I really want to have. I don't remember how I took it. I don't take notes. I don't really care. But when I saw this on the back of my camera, it looked like a frame. And so I researched, and the formula that you see here is a very high level burn rate of rocket propellant. And I'm okay with that. I'm looking for an association because my relationship with math is very fractured. It's very messy. And I didn't want anything too literal. All the images are done in black and white, and that's not by accident. When you struggle with math and people make you feel like, you know, I'm going to use the term stupid, they make you feel like you don't know what you're doing. You feel like you're missing something, and I needed to remove something from the photograph. So I removed the color. And so all the images are in black and white. And I think there's about 15 of them. They all have some sort of explanation, but for me, it's what I want you to see is perhaps an unfamiliar equation in the familiar medium of a photograph. So we don't have to understand the math to understand that I can still stand and you can still sit, right? It's not necessary, but we should, in my estimation, have some level of math to get us through life. So this was, to be quite honest, all about me and my love-hate relationship with math. And then about 2 years into the series development, because for me, series don't get done overnight, it takes a while. One last thing I'll tell you, when you look at the work, all of it has been done in studio. It's not AI generated, it's not photoshopped, it's out of my camera, digital negative. I sharpen and Photoshop and call it a day. I'd rather spend 10 years working on the lighting in my shop as opposed to 10 years manufacturing it in Photoshop. Okay, so when I get my train of thought again. So when I started to do this work, it was about me, big I don't do math. And 2 years into researching and Googling math issues, problems with math, people who don't do math, I came across a term called dyscalculia. I didn't even know how to pronounce it. I'm still not sure because I hear it both ways, dyscalculia and dyscalculia. And the first thing that I saw was Professor Ansari's interview with CBC. It was a 2-minute, 30-second interview about dyscalculia and why we don't seem to be paying attention to it. And I was like, how could I not know about this? And so I started to do research, and I fired off an email, and he answered right away. And he said, you need to go see these people and talk to these people. And I did the research, and I saw myself in some of the descriptions. And it really was a relief to know that, okay, I'm not stupid. I learn math differently. And when I really need to know it, I memorize it like a Shakespearean play, and I get her done. And it was a real relief to see that. And so the series pivoted. It was no longer big I don't do math. It became small I, about everybody and our inability to do math. And I think the question that really bothered me the most was, why did it take me 2 years to come across this term? And for me, my lived experience, it's because we as a society don't value math. I'm sure that if I had a dime for every time somebody who said, I don't do math, I could have my own gallery. Like, it would not be a problem. And we wear it like a badge of honor. It's not like, well, I don't do math, right? It's like, hey, over here, I don't do math. And we wear it like a badge of honor. And if society, this is my opinion, but if society does not perceive math to be important, then it doesn't get the awareness, it's not going to get the funding. So this whole series pivoted more into advocacy. And all I really want out of this is for a few people to walk by it and have something click and go, that's me, or I know somebody like that. And if I get that, if people relate to it that way, then my art will have done its job and I'm happy. It becomes STEM, becomes STEAM. And I think that's what art should do. It should provoke, it should make you think, it should inform. And that's what the series does, sitting over at the DG Ivy Library. And we came in today and there was a couple of people looking at it this afternoon. And I think the placement of it, Roberta, is brilliant. It just works. And I'm more than happy to have it there for the next couple of weeks. So that's it for me. Thank you.
I think that, I don't know, who wants to go first? I think okay, I'm gonna, if you want, you want? Yeah. Okay, so I'll pass it to, to Dr. Darja Barr, who is a professor at the University of Manitoba. And if you want to introduce more about yourself, I think that we should, you should, but yeah, I'll help you.
Okay. So that's pretty much all the introduction, I think. is my name, Dr. Darja Barr.
There is like a short bio that I lifted off the internet on a website, but yeah, like I think people should.
Yeah, I mean, my background is in mathematics with a PhD in education, and I've been working at the University of Manitoba for almost 20 years, mostly with first-year students and encountering a lot of these issues: dyscalculia, test anxiety, math phobia, math trauma, however we want to call it, these big issues with my students. So going off of what Anne said, and first definitely want to thank Fields for hosting us and Roberta for organizing this, and Anne for all of the thought and your personal spirit that you put into that art. It's beautiful. I love talking about it with you, and just riffing off of that and taking it a little bit farther as somebody who teaches math themselves. So I decided to talk about, I'm not a math person, or am I a math person? And it's really based on the idea of, why do we accept this? As Anne said, so many wear it as a badge of honor. I teach around 1,000 students a year, first-year students, and the amount of times I hear this in one form or another: I'm not a math person, I hate math, I don't do math. And it's like a family crest. My parents didn't do math and I don't do math. And we sort of keep this attitude going, and it becomes somebody's identity. And we would not accept this when it came to reading, which is interesting because really we think about literacy and numeracy as forming the foundation of a strong education. But even more than that, literacy and numeracy these days are required to be engaged in society, to be able to move through society in productive ways. So we have all kinds of supports that come in at very early stages when students are identified as struggling to read. But on the flip side, those supports aren't there when it comes to math. There aren't any widespread standardized tools that are used in schools yet for identifying numeracy issues and supporting them. So why is it? Why is this the case that of those two foundational pieces, reading has become one way and math sort of another? Okay, so what I've got here is what AI gave me when I said, give me 2 passages that are grade 6 reading sentences. So I want you to just read those 2 and think about not the words, but rather the mental effort that you put in to read them, right? It's almost, you read them, you don't have to think too hard. It's like an innate ability. Your eyes just read and process the information there. With the math, I think probably we could do this, but even so, even as a mathematician, you read it once, you get the gist of it, then you have to read it again. Then ideally you have a little pencil and paper and you can kind of scratch out the answer. It takes effort. It isn't that sort of behind the scenes automatic thing that happens with reading. And perhaps that's the reason why, because it doesn't at any level really become innate. It always requires effort to do mathematics. And perhaps it's not the mathematics that we're fleeing from, it's the effort. Maybe nowadays we're more likely to sort of avoid or brush off those things that take a lot of effort. I read an interesting article. It was published in 2014, so a long time ago, but I came across it more recently in the Atlantic that talked about this idea of I'm not a math person as a virus that is spreading through North American society. And it's spread through the statement, I'm not a math person, down from parents to their children, from teachers to whole classrooms. And it is spreading and spreading and spreading. And they said it's the most self-destructive idea in America today, which is a very bold statement. But given the direction that we're going, this technological society, all this misinformation out there, I don't disagree with what's said. The authors also point to the fact that in other areas of the world, in other societies, there's a very different attitude towards this kind of effort. And they talk about Japan and other Eastern cultures where when you can't do something, you work hard to get better at it. And that is the cultural norm where, okay, maybe I can't do this, but that doesn't mean I can't do it. It means I can't do it now. And here are the things that I know how to do to get better at it. And in North America, I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. Again, we kind of are more likely to say somebody else does that. That's not me. I'm not good at athletics, and therefore I'm never going to join a basketball team. I'm not going to play on my husband's softball team. I just like would avoid these things instead of being like, well, this is actually maybe an important, maybe enjoyable part of life, and I can get better at it as I work at it. They go on to talk about this sort of effort mindset that is pervasive in North American students, where some students feel like intelligence is something you're born with. Some people have it, other people don't, especially when it comes to mathematics. Whereas others who have this more growth mindset have that attitude of, I don't get it now, but it's more of a yet. I can, or I can get better at it if I work at it. And they talk about how important it is to make that mental shift and how much students can gain when they make the mental shift, just mathematically speaking, but just moving from this is something that belongs to somebody else to, yeah, actually, I can get better at this. And then they do get better at it. When my students say this to me, I always take the chance to say, well, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you say to yourself, I'm not good at something, of course, when you're faced with it, you're going to collapse because that's who you are. You're not good at it. So very important to kind of shift from the one mindset to the other. I like the quote, math is the great mental bogeyman of an unconfident America, that it's really like a plague that's happening right now. Okay, is it? Well, what's happening in Canada? If we look at PISA data, so this is just very basic. This is a standardized international assessment, 15-year-old students across the world. How are they doing on literacy and numeracy? And what we see is that for Canadian students, we've got a drop of 15 score points from the 2018 to the 2022 assessment. And many people who read this say, well, that's when the pandemic happened. Of course, things got worse. And certainly that exacerbated the situation, but we've been declining since 2000. So this is not new. It didn't happen because of the pandemic, but our scores are going down, 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 even as society is becoming more and more science technology driven. So that's kind of scary to see that and sad. And then we come to the flip side of why are we so easy to dismiss it? Well, this is a question I get very often. At the University of Manitoba, every student is required to take a math course. Whether you're a fine arts student, I teach social work students, and the question is always, why do I need to take this class? And I'm not talking about teaching fine arts students how to do calculus. They're taking a course called Math in Art. It's geared for them, but still there's so much resistance. And I think probably Daniel might talk more about this, but my answer is always, it's not about the content. I don't care if you walk out of this class and really remember anything. Something will stay in there. You'll see a flower and say, oh, there's the golden ratio. But really, mathematics trains your brain to work in ways that other things don't. Wires your neurons for critical thinking and problem solving and logic. And these are all things that you need in society. So it's not so much about what's happening on the course outline. It's more about what's happening behind the scenes, right? It's like a hockey player. An NHL player plays professional hockey, but they don't just practice hockey by playing hockey. They do yoga, they run, they do all of these sort of complementary activities to strengthen what they do. Well, it's the same thing for us, right? Like you might be becoming a sculptor, but you also live in this world and you need all of these different skills to help you. In the past, we relied on experts to give us information, right? The people who had the platforms 15, 20 years ago were people who had spent their lives researching and learning and collaborating with others. We listened to them. We trusted them, scientists, doctors. Not so much anymore, hey? Like now anybody can have a platform where thousands of people, millions of people will listen to everything that they say. So more than ever, it is important for the people that we are bringing up, from children to, functioning society members, to be able to think critically and ask the right questions, mathematical type thinking. Where is math? It's everywhere. So I pulled some pictures of some of the recent things that are happening, a lot in the States, not so much here, but of course it affects us as well. Vaccines, talking about the gerrymandering that's happening in the States, redrawing all those district lines for votes. Does Tylenol cause autism? AI, all of these things. Should we be relying on our favorite celebrity to tell us if Tylenol causes autism? I mean, everybody's getting information from both sides. We're all getting it. I'm getting it on Facebook and I'm like, don't show me this one anymore. Don't show me this one anymore. But it still comes. So think about the type of questions you should be asking. I don't care who's giving me the information. I want to dig underneath. I want to see the studies. I want to see the data. What does it say? Can I even in a rudimentary way read some abstracts and kind of make my own opinion? Because you really don't know who to trust anymore. So it's more and more important that we don't become these I don't do math people. How do you combat the mindset? Well, things like this. You talk to people, you don't let it slide. I never let it slide, no matter where I am. And I get it all the time when people are like, my little girl just started going to kindergarten. So parents, I'm talking to parents. They ask what I do. I tell them what I do. Oh, I hate math. I don't know how you do that. I don't do math. I don't let it slide. I'm like, well, you should, maybe rethink that, especially because your kid is standing right there. And maybe instead of that, we can think about it this way. And math is fun. Ada does math. I do math, right? It's just sort of counteracting it when you hear it. It is a huge systemic problem. I think it's important to make sure we're electing officials to school boards and political positions who believe that math is important and understand the value of making sure it's solid, making sure teachers that are going into K-8 have a good, strong confidence with mathematics. It's a big systemic issue, but I think that small incremental steps by grassroots movements actually have the potential to make a big impact. So what's the moral of the story? Well, everyone's a math person because really you cannot afford not to be. And if anybody wants to talk more, there's my email. I can always talk more about this. Thanks. Next battle.
The next one will be Daniel Ansari.
Thank you. Just try to get my slides.
Oh, sorry.
Just gonna hide this so it doesn't.
I was instructed.
Oh, great.
So,
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this fascinating panel. It was particularly wonderful to see your exhibition, Anne, and to have the opportunity to talk to you about it. I think this combination of this really interdisciplinary exercise that you've gone through is wonderful, and I hope more people go to see your art. So I'm a psychologist / neuroscientist. So what I'll do today is just to give you a very brief overview of what we know, but also importantly, what we don't know about developmental dyscalculia, because there really is more that we don't know. And there's a lot of ambiguity that I'm going to try to bring across today, which may be frustrating, but I think it's important to highlight this. Like you said, Anne, it's so important to raise awareness around dyscalculia. And part of that is also to say, we need to learn more. We need to have better research. We need to have more studies about the most effective ways of helping individuals who experience dyscalculia. So I'll just begin with a brief overview of definitions and prevalence. So basically, dyscalculia is a condition that makes it hard to do math. And critically, it affects numerical and mathematical processing in everyday life. I say that because sometimes we think about math just as residing within brick and mortar schoolhouses, but of course, it transfers to all aspects of life, as you also said, Darja. It's still poorly understood, and it is really understudied. And to illustrate this, this is from a rather old statistic from a book by Michelle Mazzocco and Dan Burge called Why Some Students Find Math So Hard. But this is still reflective today of the ratio of publications on dyslexia, specific disorder in the domain of reading, and dyscalculia. For every 14 publications in scientific journals on developmental dyslexia, there's one on dyscalculia. And this is really something that does persist. I mean, there's some areas of dyscalculia research that I feel are literally dying out, while they still continue to thrive in the domain of dyslexia. There was also, and again, this goes back about 15 years, Dorothy Bishop at the University of Oxford actually took all of the NIH funding databases and categorized how much money was spent on different learning disorders. Her primary interest was in language disorder, but as part of that, she was also able to reveal that there was, the funding envelope, how much the US government was spending on research into math learning difficulties, including dyscalculia, was really minuscule compared to the amount of money they were spending on things such as dyslexia and to some extent developmental language disorder. So there seems to be this blind eye, and maybe this has to do with the societal attitudes towards math as well. In terms of prevalence, we think that developmental dyscalculia affects between 5 and 7%, but I would be very cautious with these figures because they come from studies that are relatively old. There's very few prospective longitudinal studies, which is a method that you really need to estimate the prevalence of developmental dyscalculia. But I think it's fair to say that it is comparable to dyslexia, which again highlights why it's so problematic that there's so little research on it, because it's just as prevalent as developmental dyslexia. Now, dyscalculia is a term that is used quite a lot in the UK and also in European countries, other European countries. But in North America, it's not a term that is often used. If you look through journal articles from the 90s, even from the 2000s, lots of people prefer terms such as specific learning disorder in math, mathematics learning disorder, or mathematics disorder, which was actually used to be a category in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It has since been replaced by a different label called specific learning disorder, and then you have to qualify whether it's with difficulties in reading, writing, or arithmetic. But these are the kinds of terms that I think are more commonly used amongst practitioners, but also amongst researchers. I prefer the term developmental dyscalculia, but I was trained in the UK, so maybe that's why. If we look at formal diagnostic criteria, just really briefly, I think most people turn to the DSM-5 because it is very comprehensive. It's not without its problems, and if we have some time, we can discuss some of those issues. But if we look there now, dyscalculia falls under this more umbrella term, specific learning disorder, which reflects something that I'll come to later, which is that the boundaries between specific learning disorders is not as neat as we might have thought them to be 15, 20 years ago. And the DSM-5 states that a specific learning disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder of biological origin, manifested in learning difficulties and problems in acquiring academic skills, markedly below age level, and manifested in the early school years, lasting for at least 6 months. So there needs to be something very persistent to it, and cannot be attributed to intellectual disabilities, developmental disorders, or neurological or motor disorders. So that's kind of the definition that most clinical psychologists, school psychologists would turn to in order to derive a diagnosis of developmental dyscalculia. Now, one of the critical things I like to point out today is that developmental dyscalculia is often not isolated. In fact, in our research, and talking to my colleagues as well, they find this too, is that you find a high degree of overlap, or what is referred to as comorbidity in the more medical language, with conditions such as developmental dyslexia and ADHD. What's really fascinating about that is that we don't yet have evidence for a clear common cause. People have looked, and there have been some really good studies to try and establish, could we find a common cause? So for example, we know that dyslexia is associated with the difficulties of connecting letters and speech sounds. And to some extent in dyscalculia, there's a difficulty in understanding the meaning of numerical symbols. So maybe there's some sort of common mapping process that is disordered, but the evidence for that, it just isn't there yet. But every time we don't have evidence for something, it just means that we need to look a little harder, and maybe we're just not looking at the right places or at the right level of complexity yet. In terms of diagnoses, it's primarily based on cutoff criteria. So you give somebody a standardized test of math, and you say everybody who has a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15, maybe everybody who is 1.5 standard deviation or lower, we can suspect that they might have a math learning difficulty, especially if we find this repeatedly. Let's say after 6 months, we find the same sort of picture. Ideally, this is supplemented by clinical or observational data as well. I think it's really important to take a sort of mixed method approach to diagnosis. And as I've already alluded to, and as was clear from the definition from the DSM-5, ideally based on more than one measurement time point, because we're going to have false positives, right? Maybe the student was just really tired the day that they saw the school psychologist, and that's why they didn't do so well. There's other arguably more innovative approaches, which is to look at what's called response to intervention. So instead of sort of diagnosing and using standardized testing, is you try to understand which students are lagging behind their peers, regardless of the fact that they received high quality instruction. And then you start to begin to screen those students and give them assessments to try and see whether their profile fits the criterion of developmental dyscalculia. And then you try to adjust the instruction that they receive through a tiered model of instruction. And hopefully they can return to tier 1, which is where most students are after some intense remedial approaches. There's lots of issues with diagnosis these days, and this is one of the ambiguities that I kind of want to highlight today. We don't have an independent biomarker of dyscalculia. It's not like you can go to your Shoppers Drug Mart and say, I'll have a dyscalculia test, please. And it's very unlikely to ever be a reality. And that means we're still sort of using kind of arbitrary methods to designate a group of students into having dyscalculia. That's, of course, often for very pragmatic reasons. There are limited resources to help students with special educational needs, so you need some way of identifying them. But from a scientific point of view, it's a little bit frustrating that, this is kind of the level at which we're diagnosing. Another thing that's really, I think, critical is we always talk about the importance of early diagnosis, but we don't actually know how early we can identify dyscalculia with confidence, again, because there's a lack of really good prospective longitudinal studies that would tell us that. And the other problem is, and this is where researchers are guilty as well, is that there is no coherent sort of criterion of where do you set the cutoff. So research studies can range from 3 standard deviation below the mean to as liberal as 0.5 standard deviation below the mean, which is really problematic, because if we try to make sense then of the research literature, we're dealing with these issues. And even if we accept, say cutoff of 85, the test has a mean of 100, and we say everybody below this, we can suspect them of having developmental dyscalculia, is that we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that there's something qualitatively different about these students. They're at the lower end of the distribution, and that has important implications when we think about instruction. I often get the question, is there a special curriculum for students with dyscalculia? And my answer to that is no, there isn't, and there probably doesn't need to be. You just need to follow the well-known evidence-based approaches to instruction, and they should work for all students, including those at the lower end of the distribution. And Linda Siegel, who's an emeritus professor at UBC Faculty of Education, she puts this beautifully when talking about dyslexia, but you could just replace dyslexia here with dyscalculia. And she says, there are many complex issues to consider in developing an appropriate definition of dyslexia. One of the major problems is that there is no specific blood test or brain imaging result that can provide a diagnosis. Fundamentally, the issue is that reading is measured on a continuum and there's no cutoff score on a reading test that clearly divides individuals into dyslexics and non-dyslexics groups. The distinction between dyslexia and normal reading is arbitrary. Where the cutoff point is drawn varies from study to study. And you can say the same thing about dyscalculia. Want to talk a little bit about causes and symptoms. We could talk about this for hours, but I don't have all this time. But I just want to talk about a couple of hallmarks and a couple of ambiguities as well. So I think there's a large consensus in the literature that children with dyscalculia have great difficulties. And those that I've encountered, I can confirm that 100% of students that we've studied who we think have dyscalculia have this. They find it really difficult to encode arithmetic facts into long-term memory and to retrieve them from long-term memory. This is you will find, a 15-year-old boy with dyscalculia who still uses very immature counting strategies to solve the most simple problems, such as adding 3 + 5. So reaching this kind of memory-based level of being able to compute mental arithmetic problems is something that is simply very inaccessible to students with developmental dyscalculia. So I think that's we can agree on that being a hallmark of developmental dyscalculia. But what gives rise to that, there is a lot of controversy around that. There's a lot of people who've been focusing on what we might refer to as foundational competencies. We all know about phonics and reading. If you've got good phonics skills, you undergo a trajectory of growth. If you lack phonics skills and they're not being emphasized, you will lag behind your peers. This is what Keith Stanovich at OISE termed the Matthew effect in reading. But there have been some good proposals for what might be the sort of phonological awareness equivalent in the domain of math. And one study that I like to cite, because it was the first study to investigate this, was a study by Lundell and colleagues at University College London. Now, over 20 years ago, they published this work. But they really tried to understand, okay, is it perhaps that students with developmental dyscalculia just have real difficulties in understanding quantity and quantitative relationships? And here's one of the experiments they gave to them, which I think is particularly illustrative. You see two numbers and you can either judge them because they're in different font sizes by their physical size or by the numerical quantity that they represent. So you can either ask a student, tell me which number is numerically larger or which one is physically larger. And what they found, they tested 4 groups of children, a group of children without dyscalculia, a group of children with dyslexia, dyscalculic group, and a dyscalculia dyslexia group. If you want to know how they diagnose them, I can tell you about all of that afterwards. The take-home message from this is that in these turquoise colors, you see how long it took them on average to compare which of two numbers is physically larger. Absolutely no group differences at all. But then when you ask them to access the meaning, the numerical quantity associated with those symbols, that's where their performance really breaks down, and it takes the dyscalculics and the dyscalculic dyslexics much longer than either the dyslexia group or the control group. So from this, they concluded that perhaps, at least in part, dyscalculia is a deficit to represent and process numerical magnitude in a typical way. And then if we take that forward and think about it developmentally, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I like to think about everything through a developmental lens, is then you begin to understand, well, how might this contribute to them having real problems with arithmetic and encoding arithmetic facts into memory? Is because if you start out with this poor understanding of numerical magnitude, that will over time translate into difficulties in learning numerical expressions and also maintaining them in memory. You know, if you're working on a complex long division problems and you need to think about some remainders and think about them working memory, if you don't have a solid representation of their quantitative reference, that's going to make everything more difficult. So it's this kind of snowball effect that starts with this early difficulty in understanding quantity and the link between quantity and symbols, which then leads, at least in part, to these higher level problems. But there's a lot of things that we need to consider that go beyond number. I don't want to oversimplify it. I really don't believe there is only one causal contributing factor to dyscalculia. One candidate that's receiving a lot of attention is the critical role of spatial skills. There's, my former student, Zach Hawes, is a professor at OISE now. He does tons of really great work around this. And it turns out that there's a huge relationship between spatial abilities and math ability, and that training spatial abilities can also enhance math abilities. And in fact, many students with dyscalculia struggle greatly with spatial skills. I know I'm coming to the end of my time here, but I just want to talk briefly about the brain, because we put such a premium on neuroscience and the answers that it might provide. And I just want to sort of reflect on where we're at with our understanding of the neuroscience of dyscalculia. So we've known for over 100 years from the study of brain damaged patients that if you have damage to this area highlighted in red, the parietal lobe, that you start to have difficulties with numbers, comparing numbers, ordering numbers, retrieving arithmetic facts from memory. And that's what we call acalculia, which is a very different thing. It's an acquired deficit rather than a developmental one. But this led to the hypothesis that maybe developmental dyscalculia is also underpinned by some kind of impairment of the parietal cortex. And there was lots of really promising early evidence, including from my own research group here, the Price et al. Paper that we published in 2017, that sort of pointed to the fact that if you put kids with math difficulties into an MRI scanner, you compare them to kids without math difficulties, they show less activity in this parietal cortex area, perhaps suggesting that there is some equivalence between acalculia and developmental dyscalculia. However, there's lots of issues and open questions. One of them is, how early do these brain differences occur? And because we're dealing with correlational data when we talk about brain imaging, we always have to consider that what we see in the brain is actually the consequence of their lived experiences, rather than some innate biological mechanism that is driving these brain differences. And that's something that we can't really get at fully without doing longitudinal research, without doing experimental manipulations. And in many studies, and this is true of much of cognitive neuroscience, there's a real problem with reproducibility. And we have experienced it ourselves. We've recently published a paper in which we found absolutely no differences between dyscalculics and typically developing individuals in terms of brain activation during a variety of tasks. It doesn't mean there isn't something going on at the level of the brain, but it means we need to do more work. And in general, our view of the brain has really changed over the past few decades, where we consider less sort of focal areas, but more complex networks, and the integration of those networks playing some causal role in contributing to a phenotype like developmental dyscalculia. So we've got a lot more work to do with the neuroscience. So if somebody tells you, neuroscience is the key to understanding developmental dyscalculia, it's one key, but we don't have much evidence from it yet. Just very briefly on genetics of dyscalculia, because I think it is important, because there's sometimes, the lingering of the old school of genetics that is still making its way through the way people think about it. Traditionally, we used to think there's a gene for X. I did my master's in a lab that they were looking for the gene for schizophrenia. And this is, I'm dating myself now, but this is early 2000s. And that was really the conviction of the PI, was that we could find, single genetic variants that would help us understand this hugely complex disorder. And there's a long history of hunting for single genes, much like neuroimaging, based on small sample sizes. But with the revolution, the genetic revolution, when the Human Genome Project was first able to sequence the human genome, and that became more and more affordable, sample sizes went up. And what geneticists discovered is that if you take something like BMI or height, and you have large samples, you actually find that there's thousands of genes that are associated with individual differences in height, right? So we're now sort of in this polygenic era of understanding phenotypes like dyscalculia, and it's therefore very unlikely that we'll find a single gene being associated with. I mean, here you see conditions and the associated numbers of trait-associated markers in the genome, and it's thousands, right? Recently, there was a beautiful study published in Nature Genetics, the first study of sort of genome-wide significant loci associated with dyslexia. They discovered 42. I tell you that if they double their sample size, they're going to also at least double the number of associated loci. So we're dealing with this polygenic effects. And in fact, this quote summarizes where we are, which is that a typical human behavioral trait is associated with very many genetic variants, each of which accounts for a very small percentage of the behavioral variability. So we're unlikely to find the dyscalculia gene or even the dyscalculia genes. So generally speaking, when we think about genetics, whether it's dyscalculia or other types of phenotypes that we might want to observe, cognitive traits are associated with many genetic variants. And interestingly, the same genes correlate with multiple cognitive traits. So for example, there's a high genetic overlap between reading and math. So you find that the same genes that are correlated with individual differences in math are also correlated with individual differences in reading, which might help us to eventually understand comorbidities as well. So no dyscalculia gene. Helping students with dyscalculia, I'm sure John is going to sort of allude to that as well, so I won't tell you too much, but I did want to point you to one resource if you are an educator and you're working with younger students. This is a beautiful guide put out by the Institute of Education Sciences, which unfortunately no longer exists for reasons that I think we all know in this room. But this guide is still downloadable and has been archived by thorough people who want to keep good things on the internet for free. And it's a beautiful guide that sort of goes through all of the evidence-based principles. And if you go through that guide, which was led by a group of scientists led by the late Lynn Fuchs, what you will see is that basically it just uses the sort of evidence-based approaches to education that we understand work across different subjects. So direct instructions, explicit instruction, breaking things down, all of these good pieces of advice that we've derived from cognitive science over the years. So briefly, I want to conclude, and this has really been just a whistle stop tour, so please stop me and talk more about this. I'll be happy to do that. First of all, despite the ambiguity that I've perhaps put out here when it comes to the scientific research, I do want to emphasize that dyscalculia exists and represents a significant challenge by those who are affected by it. That's regardless of how much progress we're making scientifically, the experienced reality is there. And I've heard that many, many times. Greater awareness is necessary in events like this, and what you've been engaging in over the weekend are clearly going to contribute to that. However, from a scientific point of view, while we know a lot about dyscalculia, there's a lot we don't know. We need more research with larger samples. That's just a reality of where we're at scientifically. We need a broader approach, a less narrow thinking that dyscalculia needs to be specific. No, we need to look at the overlaps as well. The brain imaging evidence to date is very unclear. So if anybody tells you, we've got all the answers from neuroscience, that's simply not true. Evidenced approach from remediation are available. And here, I think the fundamental conclusion is that the approaches that work best for all learners also work for learners with math learning difficulties. And finally, I didn't have the time to think about it, to talk about this, but it's a really important point, and it is in Anne's primer as well in her exhibition, is that dyscalculia is not the same as math anxiety. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize, because it means that when students experience math anxiety, we shouldn't assume that they have a specific learning difficulty with math, but that there are other barriers, and that these two things may be partially related, but only weakly so, and that a student with dyscalculia may not actually express any math anxiety at all. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I've got my lab website here and my email address if you wanted to contact me afterwards. So thanks very much.
So we have the last speaker, John Mighton. Okay, great.
Thanks. I'm very honored to be able to talk to you today. I'm a mathematician I came to math very late in life. I almost failed calculus here at U of T when I was younger, and didn't get into math until I was in my 30s. And I really agree with what Darja said about how important math is, especially in this age when we need to be able to think through very pressing problems. And could add to that also that you know, it's very clear all the barriers that we face if we don't have math. But we can also ask about what we lost that we can't even conceive of. So there's studies now suggesting math changes executive function, a person's ability to plan, to control behavior, to defer gratification. So there's all kinds of changes in the brain that happen when people do math, and that Darja alluded to, and that are applicable in all fields. And even worse, I think there's a sense of wonder that kids lose very early through fear of math. I've seen kids cheer for math, you know, ask for extra math, but as soon as they start struggling and developing anxieties, they lose that sense of wonder. And that's a huge, given that I believe math is accessible to almost every brain based on my work with thousands and thousands of students, it's a huge loss. And I always learn something from Daniel's talks. So it was very interesting to see that the bigger the sample size, the harder it is to pinpoint exactly what's causing, you know, some of the problems kids face. And one of the very first students in Jump Math, which is a charity I founded, was in grade 6, and she was diagnosed as having MID, a mild intellectual challenge. They thought her IQ was 70, and she was testing at a grade 1 level in grade 6. She literally couldn't count by twos in grade 6. So after 3 years of tutoring, she went into academic grade 9 math, then she skipped a year and finished academic grade 10. And I've seen miraculous changes like that in students. And so either that student was very badly misassessed, or something happened in her brain. And I think that Daniel said that, you know, the estimate is about 5 to 7% of kids may have dyscalculia. And that feels right to me, because the vast majority of people, I believe, even ones who struggle in math, don't have any serious barrier, and the methods of teaching that work for any child work for them if those methods are aligned with the science of learning and have some evidence. So and then there are some kids who really have serious challenges, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly what they are. I taught one girl who lost oxygen at birth, and her memory was so challenged that was the main source of her problems. So it's with the people who really struggle and who are very hard to teach or reach, sometimes it's not even the math. So the thing I'd like to focus on today is that Darja pointed out that a lot of people don't think math is an important issue, and are happy to say I'm not a math person. But what if we could, you know, wave a magic wand and everyone suddenly thought math was important? And you know, a lot of school boards are now saying math is very important. They're across Canada, people are investing, governments, districts are investing very heavily in improving math scores, like the EQAO scores in Ontario. The provincial tests in grade 6 are locked at the 50% mark. They've declined significantly over the decade, and they can't budge those scores. Only 50% of kids in grade 6 are meeting provincial standards. So I think there is actually a big effort to change things in math, and the question is, why isn't that succeeding? And if you look at reading, there's been a huge, very positive shift in reading since the podcast Sold a Story came out, where people realized that methods of teaching that were being used in reading weren't very effective. Parents realized this during the pandemic. And there's now a huge pressure for schools to adopt programs that have evidence and are aligned with the science of learning. And that's a huge positive. I've been in the trenches for 25 years in education, and it's the most positive thing I've seen in 25 years. So there's a big shift in reading. And when you ask people, you know, what's the secret in reading? One of the secrets is phonics. Daniel even said to me a while ago that we didn't really evolve. I hope I'm not misquoting you. We didn't really evolve to read. It has to be taught. You know, phonics have to be taught. So what's the solution in mathematics? Like, what are the things we need to do in math? And that's where I think that even if we waved this magic wand and got everyone to agree that math is important, we might not see much progress, because there has been a big effort across Canada for quite a while. And I wanted to read you something. So this is from a school district explaining what they want to see in math education instruction. Our focus remains on fostering mathematical thinking that promotes flexibility, reasoning, and conceptual understanding. We're committed to instructional approaches that emphasize reasoning and sense making over procedural repetition, encourage multiple strategies and flexible thinking and problem solving, connect mathematical learning to real world contexts that are meaningful to students. So what could be wrong with that? You know, that's pretty much the mantra across North America for the past 20 years. In fact, this isn't recent. This is what people have been saying for 20 years. But there's been no progress or declining scores across North America. So is there any connection to that statement? and which sounds completely, how could you disagree with that? And what the outcomes in math. So what I'd like to say, and we can talk about this more deeply, is that what if that statement mistakes the ends of math education, where we want to get kids to, for the means to getting them there, or where you would start to get them there? And so I just want to look at that more carefully. What if we're making this mistake as a society across, you know, in education? So there's an amazing movement started by teachers called Research Ed that's sweeping the world. There's a conference organized every year by people from Boise like Nidhi Sakdeva and Jim Hewitt that more and more teachers are attending. And I heard, and so teachers were tired of being told to do things that have no evidence, being told to use programs that have no evidence. And so they've organized these conferences where they get great cognitive scientists and psychologists to come and speak for free. And I heard 2 cognitive scientists at that conference say, everyone's trying to get kids engaged in math, no matter what, whatever you can do to make math palatable, almost hide the math sometimes. Motivate the kids so one day they'll have success. And the cognitive scientists said, actually, the arrow goes much more the other direction, from success to motivation. And so recently someone sent me this paper. It's a Canadian paper, Intrinsic Motivation and Achievement in Mathematics in Elementary School. And they found, I'll just read from the abstract. Contrary to the hypothesis that motivation and achievement are reciprocally associated over time, so they influence each other, our results point to a directional association from prior achievement to subsequent intrinsic motivation, which is, and I guess there's a lot, and you guys are shaking your head, so there's some support for this view. So, and we've seen in Jump Math, the charity, that when kids succeed, especially in front of their peers, also one of our deepest motivators is a sense of mastery, of meeting challenges that look hard but aren't too hard. And when you do that in a group, you get what the sociologist Durkheim called collective effervescence. You can't believe how excited kids get when they can all succeed together without visible hierarchies, when they all think they're doing the same things. So that's, in my opinion, much more a source of motivation, success in front of your peers, than anything, any special project you could give a child. That's not to say applications of math shouldn't be taught and aren't beautiful, but so what's pushing us away from that? Well, I came across an article in Nature Communications a while ago that was published about 6 years ago, and the title is The 85% Rule for Optimal Learning. So there's a lot of evidence, according to the study, that we are happiest and our brains work most efficiently when we're about 85% proficient at something. We've almost got it. We're just stretching ourselves a bit. Carol Dweck, who is a supporter of Jump Math, has commented on Jump Math, said that the program helps kids develop growth mindsets because they're in a zone where things look hard but aren't too hard. That's sort of the sweet spot. It's also called the Goldilocks zone. Or the zone of proximal development. There's all kinds of names for roughly the same thing. And I don't think 85% is very precise, but I've definitely seen that when kids are in that zone, they flourish and their brains work really efficiently. And it's just this virtuous cycle where they get more and more engaged. I've surveyed hundreds of teachers and asked them, I've said, do you ever try and play chess against the chess players who play on the street? And I have, and I wouldn't recommend it. I've been slaughtered every time. Like, I can't even come close to beating them. And I'm a mathematician. And they're not even grandmasters. And so I asked teachers, why is that? And it's because they've developed these long-term mental representations and schemas in their brain where they can, through practice, they can just look at a position and think almost unconsciously, what's a good move, what's a bad move? I'm not going to waste my time thinking about that. And so that's where people who appear to be geniuses in any field, they've developed those mental representations and schemas. So I've asked teachers, would you have kids play the full game of chess with a little bit of coaching, let stronger players help weaker players to teach your kids? Or would you start with mini games designed by experts where, you know, can you checkmate in 3 moves, or how does a piece move, and gradually add complexity? Almost 100% of teachers have picked the second, which means they understand the science of learning. They understand the difference between novice learners and expert learners perfectly. But then I say, well, look at the textbooks you're choosing. They're exactly the opposite of what you just chose. From day one, you have to give kids rich problems that will create a hierarchy in the classroom and convince half your kids they can't do math. So it's a kind of contradiction, and teachers are being pushed to do that against their better judgment. There's also work, there's another article, I'm going to end soon, but there's an article from Science Magazine that came out 15 years ago called The Advantages of Abstract Examples in Learning Math by Jennifer Kaminsky. And so the dogma in education is that the best way to get kids to solve real world problems is to give them lots of real world problems. They call them rich, authentic tasks. It's hard to argue against that because the opposite would be poor, inauthentic tasks. But it turns out Kaminsky and other researchers like her have found that in some cases, it's better to start with a more generic or abstract representation that lets kids see the deep structure of the problem and apply it across all situations before you overwhelm them with word problems. And even when it's better to start with concrete representations, it's often best to fade as quickly as possible. It's called concreteness fading to more abstract representations. And I haven't met any educators, I don't believe, in the past 20 years. Well, this came out 17 years ago, but I haven't met any educators who are aware of that, who are making decisions about what materials to adopt and so on, who are even aware of that body of research. And in the discussion, I can give you an example of what a more abstract approach would be to problem solving. And that's not to say you don't use concrete materials, but it's a balance. So those are just some of the trends in research that don't seem to be on people's radars, and that I think are going to cause problems even if we do decide to make math more important. And are really one of the reasons why the vast majority of people think they aren't good at math, or in spite of the fact that from the evidence I've seen working with children and the studies I've read, math should actually be the most accessible subject. There's a group of French neuroscientists, I can't pronounce his name, Dehaene, is that right? Published a paper about 6 years ago that suggests that mathematicians like myself use a very primitive part of the brain that has the same sense of space and number that kindergarten kids do. So that wasn't a surprise to me because I struggled in math. I don't feel I understand anything right up through calculus unless I can reduce it to something a child could understand. And that's possible. I can tell you, you can teach calculus that way if you take the time to think about it. So it's just a tragedy, I think, that we've made this subject that's beautiful and should be accessible to all children, something that terrifies most people. So thank you very much.
We have the little mics, which I was told you should all wear if you want. Otherwise, we're gonna pass the mic. I'm gonna keep the mic here for.
Okay, I'll just do this quickly again. It's been really nice to hear, this panel is a really nice opportunity for me to hear the current landscape of a mathematics education, like especially in Canadian societies. So I'm just wondering amongst the panelists today, so whether you met before and discussed the contents that you present today, and whether is a common consensus in the expert, areas that you talk about today, and what are the things that you agree and disagree with each other, and what do you see the mathematics education in the near future? Something like that, yeah.
So anybody wants to, I guess to add to it, so it looks like it's not just that so there are a lot of agreements about math education, but there's also a lot of disagreement regarding what is like the difference between math anxiety, dyscalculia, and other type of like conditions that might not give students the chance to learn math or to be interested in math. So I guess, yeah.
I don't think I can speak to what our consensus is, because some of the people here meet for the first time just in the last 2 hours, or others, like I've known John, I think for 20 years now almost. So I think I can say that I have a lot of consensus with John over like how should evidence support math education. And I think that's where we get to disagreements that I'm not going to say exist on this panel, but exists in the field. And there are a lot of them. And John alluded to some of them, which, that description that he read out with what are the goals for math education, that sometimes people like John and myself feel that it's upside down. And that what is really lacking is a better grounding in the foundational competencies and a lot of what you might refer to as procedural learning as well, which sometimes the conceptual learning gets basically put in front of the procedural learning, and that is a mistake. I've just co-authored an article. It's about arithmetic fluency, but that's a core piece of early math instruction, together with some colleagues in the United States. That's out in Psychological Science in the Public Interest, called "What Can the Science of Learning Tell Us About Math Education?" And we spent about 100 pages going through this. So it's not a simple problem. There's lots of disagreements on the scientific level, but most importantly, there are philosophical and epistemological disagreements that are very difficult to resolve, because if you come to a debate around how should we teach children math from very different angles, it doesn't mean it cannot be resolved, but it's a tricky one. And there's something, maybe you've heard of it, called the math wars that has been raging, for decades, where math educators have disagreed on the best ways to teach math. We try to bring some resolution to that. Just the last thing I'll say is that from my perspective, and this is a very biased perspective, I think that that if we learn more about how children develop their thinking and reasoning skills, and we have learned a lot, and how people think and learn more generally, which we call the science of learning, if we take those principles and we try to translate them into classroom practices, into curricula, into pedagogical approaches, we will have a lot of success. And as John said, the science of reading is the shining example of that, where reading in Ontario, especially in reading instruction, very behind until the recent Right to Read inquiry, where literally practices were used that were not supported by evidence, and they were widespread. And we can really turn children's lives around by using the science of learning and applying that to our practice. But that's a very biased perspective. So maybe my fellow panelists want to add something.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think we have a lot in common when it comes to how we think students learn, based on neuroscience, based on lived experience. I think that some of what's happening that's causing some of these difficulties is the same thing that's happening just in the general public, which is that rather than relying on evidence and knowing the difference between good evidence or rigorous studies, a lot of what's being done in education, especially math education, but reading as well, is based on ideology rather than evidence, and people's beliefs rather than what the science says makes successful math students. I think it's sad that when you refer to reading and the Right to Read report, this was people having to fight against these ideas at the expense of students suffering and struggling, and parents having to advocate for their kids, teachers having to advocate for their classrooms for many, many years before they got heard and things changed. And I think the same thing is happening and has been happening with math for so long, but is it going to take a human rights commission for math like it did for reading? And if so, let's do it now.
Again, I agree with everything they say. And I think it's no accident that we agree so much for two reasons. Even though Daniel said there's, even in the science of learning, there could be a lot of disagreement, your panel was focused on trying to give recommendations or find some kind of common ground. And with Darja, I've known Darja for a long time too. And Darja has run boot camps for students who were previously failing in summer boot camps and got them through nursing courses, the math courses for nursing and so on. So there's two elements. There's the science and then there's the practice of working with kids. And if you're deeply engaged in those things, you tend to agree. You know, why was I able to take a girl who they thought her IQ was 70 to academic grade 9 math in 3 years? Because it's possible with every student. If you think like a tutor, you never move on until you have mastery. You go back to the right level. You give scaffolding. Anyone in this room could look like a math genius with the right support, even if you're not, don't think you're good at math. So the problem is there's no one's held accountable in the system where until the right to read, no one had to look to the science of reading, and it's even worse in math. But if you actually work with students and you know a bit about how they learn, the answers are really obvious. Like it's just simple to get kids to learn math if you actually know the math and you know the most efficient pathways through the math. And that's what Daniel and Darja have, which I think we agree so much. We've made this really simple problem infinitely complex.
I think that Anne might actually chime in because, okay, so I have like 4 questions, one inside the other. Let's see if I can sort them out. So how much does like the social status or the social and class status or race or gender influence can be a factor in developing like issues with like doing math? And if this is a developmental issue, what is the influence of the context in it? And then can this be reversed later on? I was very impressed by some of the things that Anne said when she was showing photographs, and she wants to show photographs in different contexts. And she said, oh, this context in the library is very useful. But also there were some people who were saying, why don't you go to a conference of principals, for instance? Because that might be like the technique of using images and text and numbers may actually be helpful in unlocking this like situation where some students who are, or some people who are disadvantaged maybe. And so I'm just gonna throw it at you and see who can answer. Do you wanna? Because I really like your approach.
So I think art and science, okay, we'll go with math, belong together. One of the things that I noticed, though, in talking to a lot of the profs here at U of T, is that there is no time to put art into math. You don't have the time to play. But I believe back in the day, way before I was born, which is a long time ago, art and science were one. And then I think it was, correct me if my history is wrong, in the Renaissance, they started to divide, right? And I think some people learn more visually, some people learn, we all have different ways of learning. And I think if we can bring the art back into it, in some way, it might help those who have that barrier and wear that badge of, I don't do math. If you can show them that there's also art in it. I just think that as a small child, when we were talking about this before, as a small child, you drive through the countryside and your dad said, look, there's a cow, there's a tree, but we don't have plus signs hanging out in the fields, and we don't have but we don't. And so I consider math a language. It has a noun and has a verb, like your equal sign would be a verb, right? But we don't have that, and we don't tell that to kids who are 2 or 3 years old, and they don't encounter, and this is just my opinion, I'm not an expert, they don't encounter the plus and equal signs until they get to school. And by then, perhaps there's the divide starts. And so I'd really like to see some plus signs out in the countryside with the dogs and the cats, right? And help children realize that math is part of art and art is part of math, and that they do work together. And that's all I'm really trying to do with this exhibition, is come from a different perspective, a different lens, from the art lens. And you always have, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Well, with this, what I'm trying to do is put it into STEAM and show that if I can't reach you with, 5 + 3 = 8, I had to think about that for a second, maybe I can reach you with a visual interpretation that helps you understand in your own way that 5 + 3 = 8. That's what I'm looking for.
So I'm a playwright as well as a mathematician, and have had a career in the arts. And so I agree with you. There's so much beauty kids could be shown in mathematics through art, but also, people think it's strange that those fields are very different, but all I'm doing is looking for analogies and connections and resonances in both fields. Absolutely, it feels the same doing both, except in math you can actually prove something. But and kids recognize that when they're being taught math to succeed, they see the beauty in it, and the brain is born to make analogies, to see connections, and that's what kids thrive on. And around your question about sociological impact, I'm a very progressive person, but I think progressive ideas in education, like the ones I read out, have done enormous damage, because people don't take any responsibility for what's happening in inner city schools. When you throw out a rich problem, let kids find their level, which is already inherently elitist, the idea that there will be different levels for different kids. Don't assess them, don't teach to mastery, don't make sure they actually understand it. We'll be satisfied with whatever. If 1 or 2 kids put up their hands and come up with an interesting answer, it's a great lesson. The consultants who are pushing that are not taking responsibility for the damage being done in inner city schools. And the fact that the system is being propped up by tutors. People in rich neighborhoods, people go to tutors. But less than 25% of kids pass the grade 6 exam. I said it was 50% in general, but in more challenged schools, it's less than 25%. And those are big predictors of what you'll do in the future and what kind of jobs you'll get. We just have to stop this nonsense of imposing methods of teaching on teachers that have zero evidence, and take responsibility for the damage we're doing to inner city kids. I did some demo lessons in Brixton, in the most violent schools I've ever seen in my life. Within 3 lessons, the behavioral kids are cheering. And the teacher said the behavioral kids are now reprimanding the other kids because they want to get on with their lesson. These kids became puppy dogs when they were allowed to work with success and make discoveries and make connections. So that's the potential we're throwing away in inner city schools. And it's just got to stop. Like, I've been in this for 25 years, and the damage we're doing to children, and the fact that they have a right to use every part of their brain, every one of their faculties, and we're denying them that right. It's a huge sociological issue.
I guess I want to pick up on your remarks around context and how much context matters. And I think we are making great progress in better understanding contextual variables. And of course, it's hugely complicated. I'll give you one example from a study where we reanalyzed some of the PISA data. And what we found was that we focus on mathematics anxiety, that mathematics anxiety doesn't just exist in the level of the individual, but it exists at the level of the classroom as well in statistical terms. And that's one example where you can see like how the environment and the composition of a classroom can influence a learner, right? You also refer to gender and the role of gender, and Anne has this powerful quote in her exhibition from Binner and Parsons' report, suggesting that the low numeracy confers a much greater cost onto women than even low literacy, which is something that, you know, I'm so glad you have it in there, because I hadn't read that part of the report, and I think most people are unaware of it. But when it comes to gender, I think there still is a very sort of hard to get rid of stereotype that there are some intrinsic gender differences. And just a couple of weeks ago, Stanislas Dehaene published a paper in Nature showing that, and this is in a really nationally representative sample. This is most elementary school students in France, because he's part of the council to the president when it comes to education, and he's run a big study in France. And they show that the gender differences emerge gradually and can be linked to schooling, and so it's a cultural effect that we're seeing. And even in most studies that I've run and on very foundational math competencies, we see absolutely no gender effects in either direction. In PISA, which was referenced a couple of times today, what you see is in some countries, you do see gender effect, but it can go in either direction. And the average is mildly in favor of boys. We can debate what contributes to that. But then if we look at gender differences in literacy, girls outperform boys by a significant margin across all measured countries. This is not a statistics that we talk about a lot. So I think we also have at least in the West, I think we have a very unhealthy association between the male gender and high performance in math. And it's something that we need to counteract early on, because studies have shown that, you know, very young children already have this stereotype implicitly expressed through their art. When they're asked to draw somebody who's good at math, they draw somebody that resembles more of a male than female. So there's lots of contextual variables that play into it. And the last contextual variable that I just want to mention briefly is, and I think this is really important, is the inequities that exist from an early age through the context. So if you grow up in a relatively wealthy family, your parents are likely to be educated and to value education. They're likely to provide you with books and games that foster your number skills. If you're not born into that kind of context, you come to kindergarten, you come to the public education system already with a different level of preparation. And those inequities are just going to be exacerbated over time if they're not addressed. So context is hugely important.
Exactly. Just continuing off of that, what we see happening and what has been happening is that the students who are at the top level will learn in school really no matter what kind of instruction they're given. It's supported at home. If a student is falling behind, their parents will pay for tutoring. So what's happening is when we use these instructional methods that are not evidence-based, that are ideology-based or whatever, it just widens the gap. And the students who would be marginalized are just marginalized even further. And then it's this vicious cycle, and it's generational, and it continues on.
So with the gender gap, I'm afraid I can't remember the author. I wrote about it in a book called All Things Being Equal, if you want to find the study. But there's one study where the researcher found that young girls tend to internalize the anxiety of a female teacher, and boys will internalize the anxiety of a male teacher. And unfortunately, teachers are my heroes, but unfortunately, the vast majority of elementary teachers are female, and a lot of them math-phobic. And so I actually think, just like in reading, I think girls are actually doing better in math at the elementary level, although it's not always picked up, but they don't think they are. because they're picking up on those stereotypes. And so that's why in Jump, we're trying to focus on changing math-phobic female teachers into people who love math and can teach it really well, because that will have a big impact on girls. And then unfortunately, they're going to do way better than boys in reading. I mean, in math as well as reading. Boys are a serious challenge, and we need to help help boys find themselves in this in school, because I think girls have far more potential now to do better academically than boys.
We have a lot of mics, but we keep using the same.
Thank you for the, I really enjoy the conversation of the context of learning math. And I, as an artist myself, I think about how do we engage the students, right? So to like art, to see, you know, like, because, you know, when I was in school, it's not like I couldn't, I'm not capable of doing math. I just don't see the need of making, you know, like learning math and doing the assignments and fulfilling the tests. I don't see, as the same as I don't see the need to learn English, here I am. So until now, I find it's useful and I learn. So as an art teacher, right, so I have a lot of students trying to get to architecture schools, and they have to learn math and physics, right? So I find I'm lack of like a good story to tell them, you know. I find it's really difficult for me to come up with a really great story that encourages them and engage their emotional resources in, you know, feeling good about learning math. And I'm wondering if you have your favorite story when you share your passion about math learning and what math can do. So yeah, and another comment, not entirely related to this, when you mentioned STEAM learning, and so I've been recently reading a article from Learning Sciences, Science of Learning and Learning Sciences, very similar but different people, right? There's a professor, Kylie Pepler, in California University. And she wrote a paper on how kneading can helping students to understand how mathematics works. And I also find when I'm trying to make a 3D model or work in the wood shop, right? So I find math is extremely useful. If you cannot figure it out, it won't come together, right? It won't hold together. So I'm wondering these are two questions, right? So your favorite story to encourage people. And another one is, you know, what's your opinion on project-based learning, hands-on learning, and collective learning on mathematics?
So for me personally, I think you've kind of answered the question about how do you get students who go, why do I need to be here? I had the opportunity to talk to Roberta's class last, I have no idea what day it was, Thursday. It's been a whirl. And we were talking about, you know, exactly that. And I think sometimes people forget that math is outside the classroom as well. And so I gave examples. So you want to know what your gambling score is. And I know who gambles in your class now because they laughed, right? Right. But, you know, like, I think we need sometimes to take the math out of the 2 + 2 and show them that, like you said, like there's the woman who does the hyperbolic corals, Tatiana, and her last name, I forget. I taught myself how to crochet so I can make one of them. You have to show them real world examples. So, you know, it's your social media, it's your medication, it's, you know, finding the timetables, it's sequencing, it's figuring out that you can't buy that because your visa is going to go bust, right? I think by showing them real world examples, at least that's what would work for me. And, you know, when I talk to other people about math, taking it out of the classroom and the chalkboard and showing them that, you know, this is math and this is math and this is math. You just don't see it as math. You don't put it in the folder of math. I think that's how I would answer. And that's how I do answer when people say, well, I don't need math. And I'm, well, actually you do. You need math to sit, you need math to stand. You don't realize it, but you also need math to cook. You need math to construct. You need math to bake. You need math to figure out your meds. You need math to see what time you get up in the morning. You need math to gamble. You need math to put money in your bank account. Like the list just goes on and on and on. You need math to plan. You need math to look at your social media and figure out if you, oh, wow, I got more or less, right? And I think if we take it out of the classroom and show them real world, this is how much you use it without even realizing it, maybe it will turn around to say, okay, I understand why I need to do this. But it's just my opinion.
So I agree with that 100%, that kids need to see the beauty of math in the world, the applications, and that would help enormously. There's only one thing I'd add to counterbalance that. The study in Nature magazine, in Science magazine that I mentioned, one group of students learned a concept using measuring cups, the other with abstract symbols. You would think the ones with measuring cups would be more engaged, you know, kids like to measure. They did worse at learning the concept and transferring it to new situations. And when you say, I've never experienced this, what if we're making judgments based on something no one has ever experienced? How many people have actually experienced the beauty of math if you do deep mathematics with pencil and paper and roam the universe with your imagination and discover new things? And who's ever seen that? No one, because kids are not being taught to have success. So those kids in Brixton, the behavioral violence students who cheered, I was teaching them abstract lessons on fractions. I didn't feed them pizza. They were discovering things about operations using fractions, and they were cheering for it. So we cannot make, we constantly make this mistake. Real world applications are phenomenally important, but you also have to show kids the deep structure of math and give them, let them experience math in itself too. So so I'm agreeing with you 100%, but you need to also let them experience math success in itself. Yeah. Well, you need to see the beauty of addition, which you can show kids instantly if you know the mathematics.
So I'm not a math educator, so I don't have much to add, but watch John, there's videos online, watch him teach math. And I think that's, you know, he has a phenomenal way of engaging students and especially in helping them discover structure, regularities, patterns, things that really excite young minds, you know, that are not boring at all to them, that are kind of fascinating. And I think finding ways to harness that fascination is really important.
I think generally life is unpredictable. And if you asked first-year students what career they would end up in, how many of them are going to get that answer right? You don't know where your path is going to lead and how much mathematics might be in there. Even as an artist, you know, you might go into architecture, working on 3D models. Maybe you want to collaborate with people from the math department after you take some photos. So it's more about motivating people to find their best selves and to increase their confidence across the board and to highlight some of those things that they feel the weakest at, and to remind them at how empowering it is as an individual to find the things that you feel you're not good at and improve those things. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, math is on that list. So to me, that's kind of like a very general but favorite story that I use to motivate people, is just that, again, it's not about the content. Like you said, you didn't see any value in writing the tests and finding the and nailing all the assessments, but you didn't know where your life would lead. And maybe some more of that just like holistic building can be something that we emphasize along the way.
Are there questions online? Nobody wrote down. So, but if anybody online has a question, please type it in the chat or raise their hand, and I think we can actually let you speak.
So following this discussion, starting from the beginning, I see these two main approaches to teaching mathematics, and we've heard from various people promoting both of them. One is math is useful. I mean, I can live my life. I need it. I need to do that. Therefore, I have to teach it or I have to learn it. And then there's this sort of creative flash that gets people engaged. That's another way to learn math. It both work. And I'm more the mathematician, not the artist type. So I go to art classes, and I'm impressed with what people can do in art. And I wonder, how do people do these things? Now I'm trying to imagine, when did I feel happy and successful in my art classes? It was when I could do stuff. It wasn't because someone was telling me, you know, if you can draw like this, you'll get a great job, you know, for me personally. But that's often the argument. I mean, you're saying that exactly, right? Like, math is so useful, comes to your face every single day. You can't refuse not to learn it. All right, I'm just going to force you to learn it just because it's so useful. You have to learn it. And maybe that's, John, that's why it went through the system and stayed in the system. I mean, it was just so obvious that math is so useful. Let's teach math as if it's useful and you need it. It's a easy sell. And now it's, you know, there's this other approach. So they're both out there still, I suppose, both approaches.
I'll just preface those remarks with, I'm the artist, I'm not the educator. But what happens is when people see the work, they get asked a lot. And for me, the way it made sense to me, the way my brain works, it was, I needed a valid reason to do it. It's interesting because I don't need a valid reason to do my art. I can just go off and play, and whatever shows up, and you turf it or you keep it. But for me to put the effort in, I guess, to learn the math, I needed a valid reason. And I needed it to figure out, you know, the rule of thirds for photography, where you're going to put your focal point. You know, I needed it for geometry, for perspective, for my art. So it was a valid reason, but that's just me. And I'm sure if you go out on that street and talk to 100 different people, you'll get 100 different responses. So.
I guess we are about, oh yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the great talks and discussion. This discussion is about the goals of education or math education. It's something that Daniel and I have talked about, although not for a while now. But the question is, so, you know, kids exist on a spectrum, right, of ability, whether it's in math or whatever. You can test a bunch of kids and they'll get a bunch of different scores, and some will score high and some will score low. And so something we've thought about is, you know, when you go in and you're trying to teach these kids and help these kids, there's been a lot of conversations about, you know, you need math to thrive in the world, right? So bringing up the bottom of the distribution, right? Helping those kids who are really struggling. But then also these conversations where, you know, we have all these vacancies in highly technical jobs right now. So we want to be supporting the precocious kids and supporting them to become our future mathematicians and, you know, fix the world and that sort of stuff. And then, you know, we're in this position where are we shifting the mean? Are we narrowing this distribution? And so I'm just curious, you know, we talked about this a lot back in maybe 2018, something like that, and haven't talked about it as much recently, but I'm curious from all your different perspectives as, you know, someone who was not a math person at one time, or like sees the beauty in math or successfully teaches it, like where you see the role of education in this, like at what point would you look at it and be like, yes, this is a success, we've done it? Like, what would that look like? Look it up. I'll get the steps.
Thanks. That's a great question. So if you Google a better way to teach math, just Google that, New York Times, David Bornstein, you'll find an article of a case study we did. So at the beginning of grade 5, there was a distribution of spread of 75 marks in the distribution. Like you were saying, some kids are scoring low, some high. So the lowest mark was in the 95th, the 9th percentile, the highest in the 75th, and the average in the 54th. So I've surveyed a lot of teachers. That's typical across North America, or across the world actually. In grade 5, the ones in the 9th percentile would be at a grade 2 level, and then you've got the high flyers at the 75th. That was at a private school where parents are paying money to produce that difference. What does that say about our society? That if you can spend that much money and are happy with that distribution, there's nothing we can do about it. So read the article, because a year later on the grade 6 test, the lowest mark was in the 95th percentile. And a year later, all the kids wrote the Pythagoras math competition, all but 3 got awards of distinction. The other 3 came close. There should be some kids are scoring low or high. 98% of kids could be doing that, I would predict, based on my experience. So we have to stop this idea that you either take care of the lower end or the upper. You either bore the faster kids and take care of the lower end. Everybody went further together. The faster kids did way better in a classroom that was moving forward together. And psychologically, it's better for those kids too, because Carol Dweck's work has shown that faster students often get fixed mindsets where they think, I don't have to work. I'm just born a genius. Everyone else has to work, not me. And those kids are at risk later. In a classroom where everyone sees they can get better through practice, through good instruction, it's healthier for everybody. So that article was published 15 years ago. No one's ever asked us, how'd you do that? Like, how'd that happen? And we just hired a teacher who did exactly the same thing on the eco. Like, it's possible, but to replicate those results, you have to assume every child can learn math. That's why this is a great discussion. If you assume every child can learn math, you start asking, why isn't it happening?
I think for me, the answer to your question of when are we there would be when, and it's never going to happen, but when teachers are teaching in classrooms using strong evidence-based instruction, and it's not this pendulum that keeps swinging of influence where there are these trends, not just in math education, but every 2 years, it's something different that we're bringing into the classroom. And teachers are learning about a new instructional method and they all learn it and nothing changes. Then we do this one and nothing changes. So when we start actually relying on the evidence that's out there, that being said, I've been to the classroom and I see that really with the challenges that are happening in so many classrooms right now, just again, based on our educational systems, these kids aren't getting it. These kids aren't getting it. Nobody's really getting it. And how many people are being driven from public education to private education because of these things? It just seems like we're moving in the wrong direction. And it's really scary and sad to watch.
I don't know whether I really have an answer, but one of the things that I would say in this general discussion is like, let's also remember that educational effects are typically of very small effect sizes. Even the most effective educational interventions have small effect sizes. Change is incredibly difficult, you know, and so I think being mindful of that, because I think sometimes we swing the pendulum also because our expectations are maybe, I don't want to have low expectations, but I want to have realistic expectations, right? So I think sometimes if I have unrealistic expectations, I will quickly say I'll do it a different way without sort of respecting the fact that it is incredibly hard to change human beings in any dimensions. And this is also true of education effects. So some of the best things maybe have an effect size of 0.2 of a standard deviation, which is actually in relative terms pretty large, but may discourage us from pursuing these things. So having a sense of realism about it as well, I think is really important, because that's what the evidence tells us, that that's kind of the ballpark that we're dealing with in terms of population effects.
The only other thing I would add, and this is very anecdotal, you know, you're talking about the high and the low. So I sat in some classrooms, I did a water project with a bunch of students, and the idea was, if you'd never seen water before, if a super dude came from Mars and he'd never seen water before, how would you describe it to him? And the answers were just awesome. But I watched the teachers and I sat in awe of what they have to deal with, the educators have to deal with on a daily basis. And so I think maybe in an ideal world, yes, you would want everybody at the same level and you would want everybody to move forward. But not in all, but in some of the classrooms that I sat in, I'm not sure how that would ever happen, to be honest. And they were doing what they could to get the students as far as they possibly could. But like you alluded to, the inner schools and the problems there, right? And the students with issues and the educators were pulled. They were like octopuses. They were pulled in so many different ways, just trying to get through the day. That I wonder, like, I think, you know, we all need it and it would be great if we could, but I have no idea how those specific educators would ever get to that time or that place where that whole class would be moving together. And that's just from what I sat and saw. And for me, watching that was an extreme eye opener. But
we've got studies on the Jump Method website where that happens, where whole classes move. And I agree with Daniel, though, it's extraordinarily hard. And one of the hardest things to shift is if you ask a teacher, you're tutoring a kid who's 3 years behind one-on-one in grade 5, what would you do? 100% of teachers say we'd go back to that level. We would scaffold into manageable chunks so the kids didn't get overwhelmed. We'd teach to mastery. We'd assume mastery because we're teaching one-on-one. We would change what we're doing if it's not working. We'd give lots of practice and we'd raise the bar incrementally. That's the science of learning math, basically. And when you apply that, you get the results I talked about. But when teachers stand in front of a group of kids, they've been told and trained and forced to teach exactly the opposite. So that's why you'll never see whole classrooms move. But you can actually teach a whole class like a tutor.
for a whole education of the educators.
Yes. So if that teacher shifted the bell curve, the very first lesson, she didn't assume her kids could subtract. She said, if you can't subtract 5 minus 2, go 2, 3, 4, 5. Every kid's suddenly subtracting. Within 2 lessons are at grade level because they have to do T-tables where there's a pattern that goes up. 100% of kids. So if you don't take responsibility for moving 100% of the kids, it'll never happen. And if you don't drop what you've been trained to do with whole groups, it'll never happen. So that's, and sorry I'm so adamant, but I've been watching this for 20 years. We could snap our fingers tomorrow and have all, you know, in inner city. It's very difficult, but the difficulty lies in the pedagogy.
So the question is, I'll have my own question.
Yeah, sorry.
So the question is then, how come we're not doing that?
So I wrote a play about this Dr. Semmelweis, who was found women were dying in maternity wards in the 1800s in epidemic proportions because the doctors weren't washing their hands. He did studies to show he could bring down the death rates and so on. No one believed him at the time he died in an insane asylum. And the historians think the #1 reason is because doctors would have to admit they were killing their patients. Change happens very slowly in systems because we have to admit that we've been doing harm. So that's one of the reasons. Yeah. Daniel, you say something.
But I agree with John that a lot of it lies in maybe some of the pedagogical approaches, but I think since you asked about context, these things have so many different layers, right? It's like, how much do we value math? How much do we think technology will replace math? What are our stereotypes? Where do we see ourselves going? So there's so many different layers to it that I think contribute. But the one layer that we really have leverage over is how we teach. So we should be doing that more. And I, you know, as a psychologist who's interested in learning, I've always been stunned by how little of what we study and what psychologists over, you know, hundreds of years now have established as principles finds its way into pre-service or in-service teacher education. It's been a big frustration of mine. And I feel like there's literally walls that are set up. And these walls are set up in faculties of education. They're not, teachers are literally hungry for this. And, you know, John mentioned Research Ed as one organization that provides teachers with access to some of this information, but I still don't understand why we have to create layers outside of our higher education institution that kind of fill in the gaps. We should be teaching teachers about how kids learn. And, you know, just to give you one example, one of the best ways of studying for a test is not to cram, but to engage in what's called retrieval practice, where you test yourself, right? And you test yourself in a space. This is not new. This is over 100 years old. Educators don't get to know about that in their teacher preparation courses. They get a lot of other things that are important, but also I find that in teacher education, there's very little emphasis on the subject-specific knowledge as well. So there's lots of gaps we have to fill, and we can look at other education systems that do that very successfully. And I think whilst we can't port them fully into our context, we should be taking these things seriously. But honestly, I've been saying this also for something like 20 years, and I see the walls are still up.
I don't have much to add. I face the same walls, also around 20 years of trying to make headway, of talking to teachers who are relieved to hear somebody saying things that are things that they're experiencing in the classrooms, but not what they heard when they were learning to be teachers. I don't know why the walls are there. I have some guesses, but I don't know how to get past them. If I did mathematics degrees and got hired by a mathematics department. And then I thought, maybe I'll break the wall down by getting a degree in education. And then, you know, build a bridge. And then I got the degree in education, and the bridge is just a bridge to nowhere. I mean, you work in a faculty of education. So it's been really eye-opening, difficult, frustrating, just banging head against this wall again and again. And again, what happened with reading is that it took a group of doctors, parents, teachers coming to the Human Rights Commission to do an investigation to drive change. It happened in Ontario. We were on the cusp of the same investigation in Manitoba. But math, I don't know. Yeah, or I don't know what it's going to take to get there. I don't know.
I'm sorry, but so the most popular form of lesson in Ontario is the 3-part lesson. Kids have a discussion where they all brainstorm about how they might solve something. They work in groups with very little assessment usually, and then they have a wrap up. So that kind of is the opposite of tutoring a kid, where you start at their level, scaffold, you assess constantly. Dylan Williams, I just heard at Research Ed, who's famous for assessment, said the ideal cycle for assessment is about every 6 minutes. That's not happening in a 3-part lesson. So why is that the most popular form of lesson? Why is every school board in Ontario mandated to do that? Where's the evidence it works? When it flies in the face of what teachers say they would do. When it flies in the face of research on assessment, it should be happening continuously on cognitive overload. Kids can handle one variation at a time, or when they're not experts. So that's the question, but I'm more optimistic because I think Research Ed and the reading movement is changing things. I've seen a sea change in the past couple of years, even in math. So I'm more optimistic now.
I think that on this more optimistic note, we can conclude our panel since it's already 6 o'clock and somebody has to take flights and train and whatever to go home. So thanks so much for sticking to it. And thanks for the generosity of this panel. And like, I really learned a lot this week. So, yeah, they're like, yay. Okay, thanks for the people at home. So yeah, and if you're interested in like more of this topic, just send me an email and propose something and we will put something together. Thank you so much.
I brought a copy of our new preschool program for you.
Oh yeah?
Yeah,
Great.